So just quickly, the company I work for is EDF Renewables. We do a whole bunch of things: solar, wind, energy storage, everything from grid scale power, which are big solar facilities, wind facilities over 100 megawatts in size, and that's the group that I work for. And then distributed scale, so the kind of more community distributed scale projects. And we do a lot of operations and maintenance of wind and solar energy storage as well. We've been present in Canada since 2005 when we won 950 megawatts of wind projects in Quebec. And when I started working for the company in 2010, we had our Empire solar facility that's 19 megawatts near Ottawa. And we were working on developing and building 60 more megawatts of solar in Ontario. And now we have almost 1,900 megawatts of projects put in service, under construction, or contracted across the country. So we've been very active for the last 15 years here in Canada. This gives you a sense for the projects that we have developed and brought to operation. Like you can see, all the blue is wind, a lot in Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and solar, large-scale solar only in Ontario so far. So myself, like I said, I joined EDF Renewables in 2010, developing primarily solar projects across Ontario, 2010 to 2012. Also the LRP had a couple solar projects that we built then, and worked on a wind project too. Since 2018, I've been working almost 100% in New York State because of the policies in Canada having shifted away from renewables. Our Toronto office focused on New York State. And since then, we've had under contract about 1,500 megawatts of solar energy. Our first project, 177 megawatts, is now under construction, just half an hour south of Rochester. So I've been very involved in agrivoltaics for the last, I think, 7 years or so. I'm currently an advisory board member with the American Solar Grazing Association, and a member of the NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, Agricultural Technical Working Group. And that's a group that brings together developers, farmers, policymakers all together to try to figure out how to bring large-scale solar on farmland in New York State without really taking away from the whole agricultural economy. And then previous to EDF Renewables, I worked with Shell Canada in Calgary for 7 years. So I've got an oil and gas background as well. So one slide I like to show all the time, or message I like to share all the time, is the three key ingredients for solar development. And as we all know, we have to build solar near transmission lines or distribution lines with capacity. So they can't just go anywhere. It's not like we go out there, find the perfect piece of flat land that's all under agriculture and things like that, and want to put solar panels there. It also has to have be close to a place where there's capacity on the grid lines. We also have to have available lands. So because we are part of the solution to climate change, we can't just find a perfect area and cut down 100 or 1,000 acres of trees. And we've got to do a whole bunch of environmental studies to make sure that we're building sustainable projects. And lastly is community support. And that's two different things. Number one, can we find land that people are willing to sign for solar? Can we sign leases or buy? Typically, we prefer to lease. And secondly, are the communities supportive? Because it's always easier to build projects when you have that overall community support as well. But if we walk into a community and want to develop a solar project somewhere, and we can't find landowners wanting to host, then we have to go somewhere else. So it's obviously a very key part of getting that community acceptance. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs, came up with this great paper called the 5 C's of agrivoltaics that really tells you what are the components that have to come together to make a successful agrivoltaic project. So number one is climate. You can't grow anything anywhere. Sometimes it depends on the weather. Number two, configuration. How are the solar panels configured? What's the design of the facility? Because like Uzair mentioned, there's certain designs that will allow you to do certain things. Number three, crops and cultivation. So what is it that we're looking to grow in the area? And then compatibility. What kind of equipment is used? Are we trying to design something for a farmer's current equipment? Or are we trying to design something that's more a mix between what the developer wants and what the farmer wants as well? And so modifying equipment or growing different crops to accommodate for both solar and agriculture. And then that kind of goes into the collaboration piece as well. But the sixth C that's not mentioned here that's very important is cost. So we can do what we want to do to incorporate maybe growing corn, huge combines, stuff like that under panels, raising panels maybe 10 feet or 2, 3, 4 meters off the ground. But that all means it's much more expensive to generate that electricity. And if building these solar facilities at scale, the hundreds of megawatts or so, or tens of megawatts even, to generate bulk electricity, will it be okay to increase the price of electricity by 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 cents per kilowatt hour to accommodate for that solar? Or again, is there compromise between agriculture and solar to find ways to more affordably generate that electricity while also incorporating agriculture? So basics of agrivoltaics, and I think again, Uzair went through a lot of this, but a lot of us are asking ourselves, is solar in and of itself a way of farmland preservation? New York State has a really good guide we have to follow from the Department of Agriculture and Markets that tells us what we have to do if we put solar panels on farmland. We have to segregate topsoil and subsoil so there's no loss of topsoil. We have to decompact soil. We have to bury cables 4 feet underground so that people can continue farming above ground, especially when those cables are outside of our facility fence line, because there may be some of the distribution cables that are connecting the facility to a substation. A whole bunch of other things here too. There's talk about carbon credits and things like that. And I think on solar facilities, if you have really good vegetation and you're sequestering carbon in the soil, that could potentially be a second value stream, although not very significant for the time being for solar. So again, a number of examples of different agrivoltaics that are done around the world. In Asia, Europe, raspberries, blueberries, alfalfa, goji berries, tea. In North America, Africa, broccoli, cauliflower. North America, sheep grazing. Jack's Solar Garden in Colorado, they grow, I believe it's 20, 30 different species of lettuces and vegetables. They've tried strawberries, raspberries, a bunch of different things under solar panels. And I would say if you want to know, if you want to have the quickest crash course on agrivoltaics, Google search Jack's Solar Garden. They've done a ton of research on that site. About 4 acres of land, I think, altogether. But it's really a wonderful demonstration project. Again, Uzair showed this slide already. And just a couple of extra points I wanted to mention on this slide. Again, marrying solar, agriculture, and then feasibility of a project. So the top 3 designs here, typically those have been traditional designs so far. Elevating panels high enough that we can shed snow under panels. So typically leading edge is maybe almost a meter off the ground. And a meter off the ground means you can still graze sheep underneath, no problem. So I'll talk about cattle a little bit later, but in terms of cattle, so if you had to increase the height of panels so the leading edge was maybe 7 feet or 2 meters or 2.5 meters off the ground, again, that's a lot more steel you have to buy to elevate those panels. Maybe because they're higher, the steel's got to be thicker as well. So, and then to operate and maintain the panels, you maybe have to build scaffolding to change panels and things like that. And then a lot of communities that we're working in, people don't want to see solar panels, so we got to plant visual buffers that kind of screen the visual of the panels. Well, now if those panels are an extra 1, 2 meters off the ground, that may make people unhappy in the community as well. So just another perspective from a developer point of view. The other thing too, the design on the left-hand side, so starting to space out panels more, starting to put them vertical, means we lose a lot of power density from the facility, which means now we got to use many more acres to make the same amount of electricity. So is that something we want as well, or do we want to densify the yield of electricity so we're displacing as little farmland as possible to make the same amount of energy? So those are all questions that sort of run through my mind. And again, not to say agrivoltaics isn't good. Agrivoltaics is great. We need agrivoltaics, but maybe it needs to be thought of from a higher level. Just a quick demo here on the left, just to show when you have single axis trackers, what's that shade profile look like under solar panels? So you can see every square inch of the site gets sunlight at some point in time. Between rows of panels, it could be something like 60 to 80% sunlight, and right under the panels, it's maybe 20 to 40% of sunlight. So you can find out what crops maybe grow better between rows of panels, which ones grow better with more shade, and put them under the panels. And again, this is all research that Jack's Solar Garden is doing as well. And the other thing they've been finding out too is in the morning when the panels kind of turn, you got the dew that falls onto the ground, sometimes causes a bit of rutting on the ground and does certain things to the crops as well. So all things to consider. So a couple things as I talk about the various designs on the next few slides. There's two things that are kind of a real hindrance I find to agrivoltaics. Number one, CAD cabling systems, which is cabling that goes from row of panel to row of panel installed above ground. We do that because it's cheaper and it helps reduce the cost of electricity. And also drive shafts. You can't really see it very well here, but drive shafts. So if you have trackers, some tracker designs have one motor on one row of panels and a drive shaft that goes to the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 rows of panels. So you got one motor controlling a whole bunch of panels, but you're also leaving a drive shaft in the way. So you can't drive tractors between rows of panels. So to me, those are a couple really quick, easy design changes that could accommodate a lot more agrivoltaics and allow you to drive tractors between rows of panels. Again, a little bit more expensive for electricity, but kind of insignificant compared to other changes. So I'll talk about 4 different things. And if there's any questions on the way, feel free to raise your hand or stop me. So I'll talk about pollinators, sheep, cattle, and crops very quickly. So pollinators, a lot of people think that just adding bees and pollinators to sites is not agrivoltaics because it's not an efficient enough or effective enough use of agriculture. People think that pollinators on their own will come to a site with proper vegetation, which is true. And I believe in this too. I believe that just having bees on a site is not necessarily agrivoltaics. And as long as you have a good vegetation cover, the bees will come, or you can pay a commercial apiarist like we do at one of our sites, and they make us 200 to 300 jars of honey every year on a 200-acre site, which is great for PR on agrivoltaics. Second, sheep grazing. So my favorite pun in agrivoltaics is that sheep is low-hanging fruit. So again, in Canada, we have to design panels a meter off the ground for snow. And so sheep they can very easily graze under that, whether there's CAD cabling, drive shafts, any of that stuff. The sheep don't like eating wires. They won't bother the facility, equipment, and things like that. So very easy to put sheep under panels. In some cases, we see sheep as saving in operations costs compared to mowing. And also, they don't kick rocks on panels and damage panels and stuff like that. So in a way, it's almost, there's a lot of benefits to having sheep. Plus, you have farmers on site managing the sheep, which is also another set of eyes and ears on site. If there's anything wrong, like holes in your fencing or something doesn't look right, it's more people on site to find those things. So we've had very, very good partnerships with solar grazers and sheep. And typically, they'll have a full vegetation management contract. So we contract them to maintain the height of vegetation so that it doesn't shade panels. If they have to trim, they trim. If they have to come with a mechanical mower, they do that. And some of them even cut hay on site to bring to their farm for winter feed as well. So a lot of benefits for sheep. In the United States, for example, there's over 20,000 acres of land currently grazed by sheep. So it's a pretty big business. And in the United States, they import more than 5 million sheep per year for consumption. So there's a good opportunity to have more sheep domestically to offset those imports from Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. Cattle ranching. So this to me is probably the holy grail in some areas, right? There's a lot of dairy, there's a lot of ranching. Think about Alberta and places like that. And a lot of dairy in Ontario, Quebec, and places like that. So again, cows, that kind of animal, much bigger. They can weigh almost, I think, 1,000 kilograms at full maturity. And so that's a lot of stress potentially on the solar facility, plus they're a lot taller too. So one thing that we've been thinking about is taking, now that we have single-axis trackers on a lot of sites, in the future, what if we design single-axis trackers so the torque tube is maybe 7 feet off the ground, creating that clearance under panel when your panels are in table position. And having panels in table position between the months of April and November, on only maybe 10% of the site, because you would rotationally graze these animals, so you wouldn't have the whole site being grazed at the same time. You might only lose about 2% of your energy production. And so what's the adder to cost of electricity if you're losing 2% of your annual production versus raising the panels an extra meter or 2 meters to make up for that difference? Because it's a lot more capital cost. And we think that giving up a little bit of energy is going to be better for the cost of electricity than raising everything much higher to create that additional gap under panels. And then, of course, there's other things we got to think about too, like where you've got the cables going underground. You have to put bollards to protect it from, the animals rubbing. Maybe your trackers have components, or your facility has components closer to the ground that would need cribbing and stuff like that, so the animals don't get close to those things and damage them as well. So there's other things to think about too. But in general, because our piles are deep into the ground for frost heave, it doesn't seem like there's a huge concern with cattle rubbing themselves on piles. And then also, we've thought about maybe what if we incorporate, cattle that are only maybe up to 1 or 2 years old, like yearlings and backgrounders and things like that, and not the full size. So there's a certain part of the life cycle of cattle where they could go under solar facilities, but then once they get to a certain size, they go somewhere else. And that seems to be getting a lot of positive feedback from the farming community as well. And then crop cultivation and hay. So this is another case where having those cab cables and drive shafts, maybe not a good idea, because if you're going to be growing potatoes and things like that, you may want to drive your tractors from one row to the other. And the other thing to consider too are the turning radiuses at the end of the rows of panels. We've been told that some equipment you may need 20 feet, sorry, not 20 feet, like 15 to 20 meters of turning radius. So sometimes when we only leave 5 meters or so between the edge of panel to the fence, that may not allow a lot of equipment to turn that appropriate radius. So there's things to think about with the internal part of the facility for design, but also on the exterior of the solar panels, between that and the fence, other design considerations to accommodate some of these additional agricultural opportunities. And one example I like to share all the time is our Arnprior site. In 2017, there's a young farming couple. I don't know if Chris is here today. I thought he was going to be here maybe. Pardon me? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. Well, I'll secretly go through this then. So him and Lindsay lived, I think, 5 minutes away from our site, again, 180-acre site. They were farming 100 ewes, but needed 100 ewes to make their business self-sustainable. So one fall, they knocked on our door, 2017. They said, "We have a sheep business. Can we come graze under your panels as a pilot?" So we said, "Sure, great idea." They did that. It worked out great. So ever since 2018, they've had a full vegetation management contract with us. They bring about 300 ewes to site in the spring. They lamb on site. So by July, there's 500 or 600 lamb and ewes. And then they rotationally graze them. So they move fencing every, I think, 1 to 4 days in little paddocks that they go from paddock to paddock, again, to rotationally graze. And they sell their meat to local markets. And last I heard, they were selling wool to make blankets as well. And during COVID, they made a virtual site tour that's about half an hour long. And they had a bunch of schools with students dialed in, virtually asking questions and getting answers on the fly from Chris, who was on site. So very cool video if people want to learn more about that. And today they do have their self-sustaining business, grazing this site, another site of ours, and some sites for some of our competitors as well. So it's been very successful for us and very successful for them too. And a couple last slides here. So one thing I hear about all the time is how solar takes away from food production. And one thing I wonder about is as we continue to electrify our transportation sector, if that trend continues, what does that mean for things like growing crops for other types of energy, for example, ethanol. So the United States, for example, they grow 40 million acres of corn to produce ethanol for fuel. And when you look at the numbers, an acre of solar, you can make enough electricity to drive an EV 1,000,000 miles. On an acre of corn to ethanol, you can make enough fuel to drive a car 10,000 miles. So put another way, of that 40 million acres of land growing corn for ethanol, if I take a 100-acre plot, put an acre of solar, I can put the other 99 acres back into food production and drive a car just as far. So some of these future things that may happen with our, the energy sector, somebody mentioned it's a very slow-moving sector, but it'll change over time. This is one of the things to consider. Maybe there is room for solar without running out of food, right? So we have to look at the big picture of things. So again, number of different things here, and I don't know how much longer I've got. But a number of different things as we look at the full package for a solar facility, what it means for people. So a lot of people that we sign leases with, maybe they're not doing well farming, maybe they don't own that much land because they're not big enough to self-sustain their farming operation for years and years. But signing their land into solar means that they can keep their land in the family for generations to come versus selling out and losing that land. Communities, so there's significant new revenues for communities. Some of our projects in New York State, for example, an acre of land that's farming pays about $25 per acre per year in taxes. When we negotiate our community benefit agreements and that sort of thing, that number goes up to $500 to $1,000 per acre per year. So when you look overall at the money we pay landowners and it goes to the community overall, half the benefit goes to the landowners, the other half goes to the communities. In the United States, there's this very cool census on agriculture. You can go county by county and see exactly how many dollars of revenues the farming sector brings into the area and the number of acres of land in farming. So we can tell that in communities we're developing, there's roughly $300 to $1,000 or $1,400 per acre per year of revenues from farming going into these communities. And when you look at what we're bringing to the community, it's $2,000, $3,000, maybe up to $4,000 per acre per year. So it's a factor of 2 or 3, or depending on what the farming revenue is in a community where it's only, they're only getting $400 per acre per year because they're more a hay producer than a corn producer, let's say. There's some real big benefits for communities that solar can do. Soil conservation, for example, and again, the Department of Agriculture and Markets guidelines we have to follow, very, very important. But that soil is preserved while solar is making energy so that the land can go back into farming during solar or after solar. Agrivoltaics we've been talking about, that's a holy grail. Again, if we can combine agriculture and solar feasibly at scale, those are great opportunities. And then land use is another thing too. In some communities, they want to have these massive setbacks from roads and homes and things like that. And all that does is create a lot of sterile land in some cases. Land that can't be used because it's too small for farming, and land that can't be used for solar because of these onerous setbacks. So that just adds the amount of farmland that we need to make the same amount of energy. So when people think about setbacks because we don't want to look at something, well, there's drawbacks from that too. And then the technology itself, more and more solar panels are getting efficient. When I first started, we were doing a megawatt on 10 acres of land, and today we're doing a megawatt on 5 acres of land. So the energy density is getting much, energy density of solar is better and better every year. And lastly, very last slide, American Solar Grazing Association. When I was at the Agrivoltaics conference in Chicago, I heard Patrick speak for the first time about Agrivoltaics Canada, first time I ever heard of it. So kudos to Patrick and the crew for starting this group up. I was a proud Canadian in the room that day to hear that we were leading the way on agrivoltaics. But again, solargrazing.org is the website. There's over 100 webinars on grazing sheep and all sorts of topics around agrivoltaics. So it's a really great educational resource for people and farmers, developers, anybody in industry, and encourage you to peruse that as well. So to speak, so not to reinvent the wheel here in Canada, but use examples and things that have already been done in other places. And that was it, but but quick message I wrote here this morning. I do want to congratulate the team at Agrivoltaics Canada for getting us all together to discuss solar and agriculture. And solar on its own helps us meet our climate goals, provide benefits for landowners and communities and the environment, and preserve farmland if done right. However, including agriculture in meaningful ways without significantly increasing the cost of electricity and maintaining safety and reliability is gaining importance. And I really look forward to having conversations with everybody here today and in the future, because I think this is a really important topic to be talking about.